Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Tysky Sour. I'm Michael Walker, and this evening I'm going to be joined by an incredibly eminent guest, an associate professor of epidemiology at Harvard University, no less a faculty member in the Center for Communicable Disease Dynamics there. So someone who is very well qualified, well, more qualified than anyone we've had on Tysky Sour so far to talk about coronavirus. Bill Hanage, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. That's a very generous introduction. I wish I could show you the emails I've just received from people who don't agree with you.
Oh, really? Is there some real sort of fisticuffs going on in the epidemiological community at the moment?
And I can honestly say I don't think this is an epidemiologist. They're making some comment about how there's no correlation between education and intelligence, and they're using me as the example. And I'm wondering if I should just reply that you need a sample size which is larger than 1. And even if it's true, there could be an inverse correlation. So, I mean, but I think I'll leave.
The kind of row you shouldn't get into with a professional scientist, isn't it?
Yes, I'm pretty sure this is not a professional scientist. But.
I'm very pleased to have you on because I first came across you and your work back in mid-March when the government, or our government, was still pursuing a herd immunity strategy whereby they were going to let the disease run riot so as to have, 60% of the population get it in a few months before winter. And you popped up on BBC News saying this is crazy, this policy is incredibly dangerous, and they should divert their course immediately. I have to say it was a similar thing to what we were saying on Novara Media at the time, but obviously it's something which has a bit more force when it's coming from an associate professor of epidemiology at Harvard University than some left-wing podcasters in London. But I don't know. Do you feel like these interventions have had much effect? Sort of like the direction of the government has changed?
I don't think I can take particular credit for that. I'd love to think so, but I also think that they have probably been, they have been getting a lot of information, and not long after that, obviously, if you look at the imperial modeling, you can see that there was pretty severe evidence coming out of that without non-pharmaceutical interventions, or that's what the fancy word for social distancing, you could have a very, very, very hard pandemic, at least in the first wave. And so I think those things taken together led to a bit of a change in tone, and I'm very glad that it happened.
So the structure of this show, at the start, we're going to talk about the government policies up to now, and those initial mistakes that were made. But the main theme of the show is going to be exit strategies. I don't know, some people like that phrase, other people don't, but the idea of what's going to come after the lockdown, how does one avoid a second peak, and what are the government are looking at doing, because it seems like there are certain splits between some saying let's prioritize the economy and get out of this early, and others saying no, let's completely suppress the virus to have safety first. As ever, we want to get more people watching the live stream, so tweet your comments on the hashtag Tysky Sour and share the link to this show. I wanted to start by getting up a paragraph from your piece back in mid-March. So this was in The Guardian. I think it came out sort of the day after you were on BBC News that day. So we can get that up now.
I was writing frantically.
Your house is on fire and the people whom you have trusted with your care are not trying to put it out. Even though they knew it was coming and could see what happened to the neighbours as they were overwhelmed with terrifying speed, the UK government has inexplicably chosen to encourage the flames in the misguided notion that somehow they will be able to control them. So I mean, we have touched on this already, but I thought maybe could you explain, precisely what you were arguing back then when you looked at Britain's strategy? What were you thinking? What was so wrong with it? And to what extent do you think that was a time-limited strategy which is over now, and the government have basically responded to many of the concerns that were put to them along the lines that you articulated there?
So I think the important thing here is how you interpret the data as it was coming in. And I hope we'll have a little chance to do some sort of basic epidemiology as well, because it's helpful to understand. But if you're trying to understand the sort of impact that an infectious disease is likely to have, you often spend a huge obsessive amount of time worrying about how many people it's going to infect, and then how many of them are going to get really sick, and how many of them are going to die, and how many might not be being picked up in current surveys. So, like a lot of people, I was worried in January, but I also spent a huge amount of time asking questions about things like I just sort of say, well, how many cases are there really out there? How are they testing? And we would be scouring reports from China to see if you could figure out how many people were being tested. But then you sort of think that's actually not necessarily the right way to be thinking about this. You look at Wuhan, and then you certainly look at Italy. And once you've looked at those places, then it's pretty evident that whatever else there is about this virus, no matter what other properties it could have, it has the capacity to hit places like that. And if you know that that's the case, if you know that there is a virus which can metaphorically set a place on fire, and in particular do real damage to healthcare, then you should be doing something to stop it. And you take the mitigation strategies earlier on. You put in social distancing earlier on. You make much more effort to sort of trace contacts and prevent it getting onto your shores. And once you've collected enough data, then you can start coming up with something which is a little bit more refined. So right then, what was motivating me was that I could see that it's absolutely true, incidentally. I was talking about the UK's herd immunity strategy. And somebody who I was working with in the office just laughed. And I sort of said, no, really? And they replied, what? Are you sure? I thought you were making a joke. And I sort of showed them a website, and they were like, oh, good God. So there is the initial stages of this have been motivated very much by avoiding the worst. And now that there is hopefully an element of curve flattening going on in places like the UK, and of course New York City as well. I should note that I'm actually much more on top of the American numbers than I am on the British. So please, correct me if I say anything which is obviously wrong. But if you look at the fact that the UK numbers are beginning to look as if there might be a plateau, that's good. That's the curve being flattened. If you haven't done the things that you've done, you would have seen it continuing to go up and up and up. And so you should be very pleased that hasn't happened. But it is about time that we started talking about what comes next.
I want to move on to that what comes next in a moment. But first of all, I do just want to continue talking about those events in March. And actually, to do this, I want to bring up the headline to that piece. So the headline to that piece was, I'm an epidemiologist. When I heard about Britain's herd immunity coronavirus plan, I thought it was satire. And what's interesting about this to me is that it seems like, yes, you're an epidemiologist and you were proved entirely right when it came to the need for the government to implement social distancing measures much sooner than they were going to. But the government's defense this whole time has been, look, we were also listening to epidemiologists. We've been following the science. They told us that we didn't need social distancing measures earlier. So I suppose the question is, for you as a scientist watching all of this go on, and then you see the government sort of standing up and saying, we're following the scientists, and you even get some very eminent epidemiologists going on TV and arguing in favor of a policy position which you thought was crazy. Sort of like how what's going on here? Because it can be very confusing for the outsider to work out the politics and the interplay between politics and science here.
So let me start by saying something which is I want to make something perfectly clear. What I've been trying to recommend everybody do when they talk to the media is they distinguish between three classes of information. The first is stuff that we know for a fact, like this is a beta coronavirus. That's an example of a fact. There was a massive outbreak in Italy. That's an example of a fact. Then there's stuff which I can speculate about based on my knowledge of this and a lot of other infections. And then there's stuff which is pure speculation, which I don't know anything about. Now, what actually has happened in the UK government's decisions, that is basically pure speculation. I don't know. What I will say is that if you think about herd immunity is a thing. I don't like the term herd immunity because I think it's a bit misleading and it doesn't really help public understanding. I prefer to talk about population level immunity. So if you want to talk about controlling an infection through population level immunity, yeah, that's a thing, but it matters how you get there. So let me just explain first of all, what the kind of immunity we're talking about is. Based on what we think of as being the reproductive number for this, which is probably around 2.4 to 3.5 or so. That reproductive number is, by the way, that's the number of onward infections you would expect if you just dropped an infected person into the middle of, anywhere, Coventry, for the sake of argument. And how many, on average, would you expect to result from that introduction? Now, that is not actually a universal constant like, say, pi. It's something which will depend on the number of contacts which are being made. So our estimates are that it's somewhere between 2.4, maybe 3.5, depends a bit on where you are and where you're estimating it. Now, if you look at that, you are not going to get that number. You're not going to get the peak being reached and population level immunity to slow the spread of the virus until around, 60, 70% of people have been infected. So think of this as an epidemic curve. That goes up. Oops, up. So you're doing that. Once you reach the top of that, you've still got all the way to go all the way down on the other side.
Mm.
So it's not that it'll get to 60% and then suddenly go, all right, I've had my fun here, I'm going to leave. It'll keep infecting people just at a lower rate. And so more people will be infected in total. And obviously, as we know, this has a particularly, severe effect upon certain people with comorbidities and perhaps, older folks. So obtaining herd immunity with a vaccine, for instance, population level immunity, I write my own rules. Achieving population level immunity with a vaccine is great. Achieving it with the virus is, really, really dangerous. But this is also part of the great opportunity to explain the role of distancing, because let's say the population level immunity that we wanted getting is about 60% of people. Okay. Now, what that actually means, or around that, is that let's take an R naught of 3. So on average, if you drop a person into Coventry or wherever, they infect 3 others. All you need to do to get the reproductive number to 1 is to stop 2 of those people being infected. So each one person infects 1 other. That way, you are not going to get these exponential surges. You're not going to get the threats to healthcare. You are not going to need to be doing things like, you all are experiencing now. And that, I think, is a crucial part of what comes out of the next stage of this. Because the critical thing after we get out of, the situation which you're in now, I've been at home for 5 weeks or so. My wife is on a Zoom call with colleagues in the other room. She's also an epidemiologist. Our children are downstairs. Bought them a bow and arrow, which I think they might be using to try and shoot squirrels. This is not the sort of life that I want to have either. But this is what is needed in order to bring that reproductive number down so we defeat the surge. And now we have to figure out how to move beyond that. And perhaps, I think the way to think about it is not to think of throwing open the windows and saying, whoa, lockdown over. The way to think about it is to instead think about how you can refine. We can refine and get smarter with the things that we're doing. We can put things in place to prevent another surge. We can be sure about what we would do as a reaction. Those are responsible things, and those are the sort of things that we can start talking about now.
And we are going to start talking about those now, because we're going to talk about exit strategies. And to sort of introduce this part of the conversation, I wanted to bring up first a graphic. And this is, showing what's become known as the hammer and the dance. I don't know if the concept was introduced by Thomas Payo, but it's sort of been popularized by him at least. He might have come up with it all together. So we can get that up now. And so what that is showing is the black line there is if you do nothing, you just get this exponential increase. Presumably that would be all the way until the natural peak and 60% of the population have got it, and then you start coming down, but you'll have overwhelmed your ICU capacities and a hell of a lot of people will die. Your red line is your mitigation. So that's, you've got some mild social distancing, but it sort of keeps rising for forever and ever, and a bunch of people will die. And then the green line, which is what all of the countries who've done a lockdown have taken, is what he's called the hammer and the dance. So the hammer is the stage where you are trying to implement very extreme social distancing measures so that you can get the reproduction rate, in his model down to about 0. We're going to debate the fact that there's disputes as to whether or not that's desirable or necessary in the British government, but in his model, you get that down to about 0. And then you have what he calls the dance, which is where you have more subtle but sort of more intelligent measures as to how you keep R low. So at that point in time, his suggestion is that you won't necessarily need to be locked down, but if you've got a significant degree of test and trace and some more basic social distancing measures, you can avoid a damaging second peak. So we're going to put there as sort of like a theoretical introduction. And then I also now want to go to how this is translating into a practical debate within the UK cabinet. And to do that, I'm going to go to an FT story on this. So I'm going to get a couple of quotes from that story up now. So cabinet strains on the exit strategy from the lockdown surfaced at the end of last week when Mr. Gove joined Mr. Sunak in arguing that the economy should start to reopen even while the virus was present in society. The split centres on how low the reproduction rate of the virus, known as its R number, should be before the lockdown starts to unwind. Government officials confirmed that Mr. Gove and Mr. Sunak believe that if the R number is sustainably below 1, where the number of new infections is no longer rising, then restrictions can begin to be lifted. But Mr. Hancock wants the R number close to 0 before beginning to reopen the economy, arguing that Britain cannot afford another damaging peak. The government's current lack of testing capacity is a key issue. I'd interpret this, and I want to put it back to you, obviously, Bill, someone who knows a lot more about these things than me, is that you've got Gove and Sunak who are interested about opening up the economy a bit sooner because they're worried about the economic damage that's being done. And that means they're willing to reopen it before the lockdown has got the R number down to 0. So while there's still quite a lot of coronavirus in the population, but it's at a level which the NHS can manage and will retain social distancing measures which keep the R below 1. Which means that we won't get exponential growth, but we'll still have, a steady flow of people dying. But the economy can move on slightly more as normal. And then you've got Matt Hancock, who's going more for this sort of hammer and dance approach, where he's saying, let's get it right down all the way to 0, and then we can try and keep it close to 0 with potentially aggressive test and trace policies, or again with social distancing measures, potentially a bit more extreme than what Gove is proposing. I don't know where if you feel like the FT have put forward there what seems like a reasonable debate between people that understand epidemiology in Britain's cabinet, and where you stand on this particular divide.
So I think that one of the things that's interesting there is exactly who's saying what. I mean, I can understand that Matt Hancock probably has a better idea of what has been happening in the NHS than most. And so I can understand that he might be really quite keen to stop that happening again. You also brought up something which is incredibly crucial and which is not being considered in any of those things, which is the importance of testing. I mean, the real this has been a problem in this country as well. You can be incubating a tinderbox, which is going to rear up and blow up and do intense damage to healthcare without knowing it if you're not doing sufficient testing. So to an extent, the debate between these two things becomes somewhat academic in the absence of being able to do that, because of the fact that you're going to be struggling with the ability to know what is going on. So even if it's like you think you're in the dance and it's 0, then okay, how are you going to know that it is? Are you going to just sort of realize when suddenly a lot of people start dying in care homes? Similarly, if you're trying to keep it ticking along at around 1, such that the NHS is able to cope, and by the way, I think that the NHS capacity could probably be enhanced a little bit. You can get more PPE and stuff in advance, so you're ready. You can do things like that. But again, if you're trying to keep it around 1 and avoid another damaging surge, if you're not testing, you have no idea what's going on. I mean, it's very, 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 it's inexplicable to me why you'd even go there. Now, as for which of those situations I favor myself, I'm going to take one of these, I'm going to have to punt that and say, I'm not altogether sure, for the simple reason that this is a pandemic, and being a pandemic, it means that it's really hard to understand, you're going to be getting reintroductions. Even if you are having fantastic control where you are, even if you're absolutely on top of your game, you have to realize that it can suddenly come at you from somewhere else. And I mean, let us look at Singapore. Singapore has earned a lot of justified praise for its extraordinary public health authorities and their abilities to trace things down. I mean, this is partially because they had experience of the first SARS. So that part of the world is extraordinarily very good at this thing. But they have had a surge of cases recently as well. And as a result of this, as a result of the fact that this is going to be a global issue, we are going to have to be thinking very, very carefully about how it's going to be potentially brought in from somewhere else. Because even if you do something really, really good, it doesn't mean that your neighbors are going to do something really, really good.
I want to park that point for a moment because I want to sort of separate the two strategies to talk about their implications. So the one of them being what to me seems like the Gove-Sunak model of slow herd immunity, and then the other, which is let's have a really strong hammer and then try and keep it out. And I want to bring up travel bans in that one because to me it doesn't seem like the most unreasonable policy at this point in time, and that's someone who's fairly into liberal migration systems, etc. Before we do that, though, there are 1,300 of you watching this show live. There are only 428 likes, so smash the like button. It doesn't cost you anything. And as you'll know, if you were watching yesterday's show, my new obsession is getting up the number of subscribers to our YouTube channel. So if you haven't already, click that subscribe button. I want to go back to this, what I think of as a slow herd immunity strategy. You might disagree, in fact, actually, so I suppose that's an open question. But this idea that the Gove-Sunak model, which if you were listening to the chief medical officer, I'm not expecting you to, I know you're very busy, but I'm watching these press conferences every day. The chief medical officer today was basically sounded like what he was going for was a policy where it moves quite slowly through the population, but we do let the virus sort of take its course, as it were. And it seems to me like they are still adopting a herd immunity strategy, but it's just not in the same time frame as the original one. So the original strategy, to me, it seemed like they were saying, let's try and get herd immunity in 3 months. Now it seems more like they're saying, let's get herd immunity in a year and a half, for example. Does that sound sort of plausible to you as one as a strategy and then as a potentially sensible one?
Well, I think without testing, then it's not really a strategy at all, because you're not doing anything to prevent it building up and causing another surge. And you don't seem to be knowing what you would be doing anyway. So the first thing has to be testing. If you're then trying to get it through the population as a whole, there are some very difficult things that we've got to be thinking about moving forward. And one of them is something which has often been talked about, and which is the kind of thing which epidemiologists worry about, which is the possibility of what people call a second wave. Now, second waves are things you learn about at school in epidemiology anyway, because of the fact of the 1918-19 flu pandemic, which was the last pandemic which is comparable with this, and which killed 50 million people worldwide. That's 50 million, we estimate. Now that pandemic had an initial wave, and then it came back in the autumn. I've been in this country too long. Much harder, much harder. And so there's this anxiety that people have about a second wave, in particular, if not enough people have gained any immunity in the first wave. Now, I think this is a reasonable concern. I think that obsessing about it to the point that you would have allowed your health service to be overrun in the way that Lombardy was overrun in northern Italy, or indeed parts of the UK have been struggling. I think that doing that is wrong, and the reason is as follows. Influenza virus experiences what we call strong seasonal forcing. Strong seasonal forcing means that it transmits badly in the summer. Flu loves cold, dry weather. It hates hot, humid weather. So at the end of the flu season, as cases start to decline, it disappears virtually entirely in the summer. Now, we don't think that that's true for this. We don't know. Again, we're in this category of stuff where we are uncertain. But there are several reasons to point to think that it might not be the case. The first is that if you look at what other beta coronaviruses do, it's very much, they have much weaker seasonal forcing. And I'm basing that on things like SARS, the original SARS. Sometimes you'll hear people saying that SARS went away because the weather changed. But SARS went away because of the fact that transmission happened once symptoms had developed. So there was not the asymptomatic transmission, which is crucial to this virus being a pandemic threat. So as soon as people started avoiding folks who were coughing and sneezing and did a bit of mild social distancing, then the reproductive number came straight down. Now, other beta coronaviruses, and there are two which cause colds, you've almost certainly had one, they also seem to experience weaker seasonal forcing, so you can get them in the summer as well. So taking those observations together with the fact that, as I said, we've been seeing lots of transmission just recently in tropical Singapore, I don't think there's very much reason to think that we're going to be, that if we take our foot off the gas, it's just going to sit there and wait around until we get to the autumn before it starts taking off in a big second wave. I think that there is a perhaps responsible thing to do here, which is trying to figure out if there is a way in which any immunity can be built up at all. Because once you get to the autumn, you're going to be having to deal with this, and you're going to have to be dealing with flu.
And so let's look at the other option now, which is to say, instead of you go for, you know, letting it run through the population, you say, let's have a full suppression model where we try and sort of get it all the way down to zero and then don't let it go back up again. And I mean, this is, for me, the big worry with this is that whilst for someone like me, that might be a reasonable, you know, a reasonable option to take. If you're older or vulnerable, it means that you might have to stay in your house for 12 to 18 months, which to me seems like a very high cost. Which to me is the best argument to go for. Let's go for the strong hammer. Let's have a really intense lockdown so that we can basically get the virus down to zero and then sort of start again as if we never had it, but acting as if, you know, acting how we should have done in the first place, which is aggressive test and trace, isolate, and potentially travel bans. And this is, I think, you know, what they've managed to do fairly successfully in China, even though potentially using, you know, means that people wouldn't be happy with here. But then also in places like South Korea, using, you know, much more liberal means, which is just incredibly intense testing and test and trace regimes. Is that something that we should be aiming for in Britain? And do you think it's going to be remotely possible? Because my sense is the government have already sort of given up on something like that because they don't think they have the capacity.
It's a tough question. And it also is, as with so many of these things, I'm having to pull back on the thing where I say, when people say, "Oh, this country has got a really good control of this," I always want to add the words "so far." So, you know, I mean, watch China, see what happens there. The sort of things that China has been doing have been really quite extreme. It's one of the things which irritates me slightly because, so if you look at the different things that are called lockdown in different parts of the world, you've got China, where there's enforced central quarantine. You've got the UK, where the teenagers are still drinking cider in the cemetery. And then you've got Florida, where, I mean, I don't know that this is the rules in Florida, but questions that I've been getting from journalists suggest that the main thing that happens there is that you have to get your business, you know, assigned as an essential business, and you fill out a form and it comes back. Because a lot of businesses in Florida seem to be essential that you might not think were essential. So whether or not you can get it out and then keep it out, it's very difficult. I'm not sure that it is possible. Again, this is because it is a pandemic, and you're going to be seeing this for, you know, it is going to be continuing. The comment I made about the world there is going to be true for the entire planet. If those numbers are correct, we're going to have to wait until a huge number of people globally have been exposed. And so even if the UK can be doing pretty well at tracing and all that sort of thing, and I thought it was doing well back in February. I was kind of impressed at the absolute sheer professionalism of the way in which things were being caught. But unfortunately, that didn't remain. You'd have to do that. You'd have to couple a really intense treatment, test and trace, sorry, with the sort of infringements upon movements. I feel the same way you do. There are things about travel bans, which I think is what, I don't know if you heard the door slam, by the way. I think there are children in the house. If you get travel bans and things like that, and you combine them with, they work sort of at the start and at the end of something like this, because of the fact that once you're in the middle of it, and if you're as likely to get infected in your local corner shop as you are at some major international exciting gathering, then it isn't really much sense in banning a great deal of travel. However, the focus has to be on preventing future surges. And I would say that regardless of whether or not you're going to keep it all the way down, such as to protect people, or if you're going to be going for this sort of, long, slow thing in which pretty much eventually everybody is infected, but nobody has died because they couldn't get a ventilator. Either of them are going to depend upon testing. So roll your sleeves up and get testing. There was one more thing I wanted to say. You made a comment about the vulnerable. I think that this is a really important point. WHO have been emphasizing the last few days that there's a new normal, and I think that they're right. So what in some ways you should be trying to think about is how you can maintain protections which are present in the current situation, and just hold on to them while making them more tolerable. Even if it's just a simple way in which you can manage to get people who are, who you consider to be low risk, much lower risk, being able to sort of interact with each other. So, for instance, in the US, I don't know if they've been talking about this so much in the UK, although I did see a comment from somebody at the London School that suggested there was discussion on these lines. We talk about isopods, where iso is for isolation and pod is like a gang of people together. My family is an isopod. We don't wear masks or keep up social distancing in the house, but whenever we go outside the house, we feel as if we're going from the green zone into the yellow zone. The green zone is where we think the virus is not. The yellow zone is where the virus might be. And the red zone is where we know it is. And whenever we go from one of those to the other, we sort of take a bunch of steps in order to minimize risk of infection. So things like that, thinking smartly about, how to teach, the older population, how to be doing very careful things like that. Stuff like that is the kind of way you think you ought to be doing to try and maintain this, because there is no guarantee that you are going to be able to keep a lid on it. And again, you wouldn't even know if you're not testing. So try and help people. That's the thing you've got to do. Just try and think whatever you can do to help, to make it tolerable, no matter how long it lasts.
The isopod thing, I think, is, it's an interesting idea. I also find it, it seems a little bit dystopian. That I can imagine the sort of secondary school thing where you sort of pick your 6 best friends who you're able to hang out with for the next 12 months. And then you've got some people who, like, everyone's like, well, you be in my isopod. And then other people who's like, no one's asked me to be in their isopod. But we'll see how that kind of thing could be organized. I mean, I suppose I kind of bring up the vulnerable thing because it seems to me that's the sort of added reason why you might try and do the really ambitious thing of completely suppress it and then have a testing and tracing regime that's so intense that basically you're fairly confident that not many people at all have coronavirus at any one time, because then older people can then go to the shop without particular fear, whereas the Michael Gove, Rishi Sunak plan, where sort of like maybe around 2% of the population will have it at any one time, that's when as an older person you've got to hang in your house until everyone else has herd immunity, which could be a very long time.
Yeah, I think practical things like the getting of, if you have a situation where there is an age, if you're getting a thing where it's like people over 70 are the only folks who are allowed to go shopping between the hours of 9 and 10, that seems to be something which would be helpful, to say the least. Grocery store, again, there's a very thorny discussion here, and I think the evidence is still developing, but here, we are seriously talking mask use. Not masks necessarily to stop you becoming infected, but to avoid you transmitting in case you are, because we know that asymptomatic transmission is possible. I'm not going to come down either side of that, but I'm going to say that there are multiple steps that are being seriously considered in places across the world that are going to be really helpful in informing how to move forward. I mean, where I live, there is absolutely extraordinary variation, right at the level of like local communities. So in the city where I live, the schools were shut before the state shut them because they were shut by the city. They are now going to be shut until next school year, at least. I mean, I would hope that there'll be, I can hope that they'll be able to open them then, but I'm not going to say that I know we're going to be able to. But so the action taken by the city was before the action was taken by the state. And there's this famous comment that the states are the laboratories of democracy, but right now they're kind of laboratories, because what we can do is we can look at the stage of the epidemic in each of them, if only we could get good testing data. By the way, note that I'm trying to avoid touching my face and scratch my head with a pen. It's one of those things which I got into in mid-February and I haven't got out of yet.
I think I've actually touched my face with my finger a few times on camera during the show, so you've put me to shame there.
I'm so sorry.
I will try and find some sort of
implement
device where I can. Yeah, I suppose my glasses, they can do what you do.
Yeah, glasses are very good if you wear glasses. And if you don't wear glasses, well, now's the time to feel jealous of the specky people who do. So when you go and look at the different states and the different things which have been happening at local levels, I think we'll get more information. But I do also think that there's going to be an absolute dire need to protect the vulnerable, which is going to be pretty much for the foreseeable future. But that also means things like how do you stop them being isolated? How do you, how can you sort of get them? How can you get them groceries? How can you keep them active? I mean, that's a crucial thing. I mean, do you get them all into like a sports hall to do their sort of aerobics while keeping a certain distance from each other? I mean, these are difficult problems, but they are exactly the kind of problems that you would look to a government to solve.
I want to go through some of the technologies and sort of how useful you think they would be. But first of all, you're watching Tysky Sour, you're watching Novara Media. As you know, this channel is only possible because of your kind support. If you haven't already, please set up a subscription at novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, or give us a one-off lockdown donation. As you'll have noticed, we keep upgrading our technology. My internet is much better than last week now. There was a couple of appalling grainy shows last week, but I feel like I'm much clearer now. We've got webcams at home. I've sort of put on Insta sort of the little setup we've got. So we are adjusting to life in lockdown, but that does require some of your financial support. So if you go to support.novaramedia.com, that will be very much appreciated. Right, let's talk about technologies. Vaccines is the most obvious one. So what we've heard is, what Chris Whitty, the CMO, said today is that the only exit strategies from coronavirus, not so much from the lockdown, is either we find a vaccine or we find therapeutics which are so good at treating coronavirus that it can be under control. Even if you catch it, you don't suffer too badly. I want to focus on vaccines for a while. So there's sort of two questions here, which is one, how long will it take? And that seems to be, to me, the question which has dominated media discussion. But something I haven't heard questioned very often, and maybe that's because it's not an issue, you tell me, but how confident are we that a vaccine can be found? Because I know there are lots of sort of illnesses and diseases where the initial plan for pandemic control was a vaccine, say like HIV, and then they sort of discovered somewhat down the line that that's never going to be possible. Like, how confident are we that we can have a coronavirus vaccine?
We're in that category of we don't really know. But the fact that I'm saying that at all means that we are not sure that we can develop one. I mean, a lot of very clever people are going to be trying to, and there is obviously hope that they will be able to. However, we do not know at the moment. We haven't made a vaccine to other beta coronaviruses, but then there hasn't been the need before now. So I would say that I wouldn't pin hopes upon a vaccine. We are learning all kinds of interesting and good things about how to treat patients. So, I mean, you'll probably hear some people saying, oh, they said there was going to be this much need for ventilators, and there wasn't, so you can't believe anything these people say. Well, that is probably likely because of the fact that we've got better ways to treat people without being so aggressive with ventilators. When those projections were made, they were on the basis of what we knew about infections at that stage, but there are ways of treating people with like high flow oxygen, which does not require ventilation, and they seem to do just as well, which is great, by the way, because nobody wants to be on a ventilator. So we are learning new things about the virus and about the best way to treat it all the time. I cannot put my hand on my heart and say with absolute confidence that there's going to be a vaccine. I just can't do that. If there is going to be a vaccine, it will be on a long time scale. It'll be sort of, I mean, we're a few months in now, I guess, but a year to 18 months. There is just possible, and my colleague Mark Lipsitch has been trying to look into some really interesting sort of alternative, ethically viable trial designs in which you might be able to take individuals who were not expected to have any risk factors and offer them a relative, and if they volunteered, note here, they had to volunteer, they could be exposed with the vaccine, having been vaccinated. And that could really accelerate things because you wouldn't need to do the sort of randomized trial. There are also funny things about sort of vaccine trials in general when you start looking at, you know, things coming down, because this was true with Ebola. I mean, again, you see it coming up and then it's going down. As it's going down, if you are sort of seeing a relatively low rate of infection, then you might have to be doing a very, very large scale trial in order to detect the effect of the vaccine. And of course, the larger the scale trial, you know, the longer it will take. So we have so many moving parts in confronting this that we are going to really be struggling with this for some time. But we are trying to, but there are people who are trying to come up with ethical ways of accelerating the process. But whether or not there is going to be a vaccine, I do not know.
That's really interesting. I didn't realize that was how we might be able to truncate the sort of process of testing whether they work, because presumably normally the ethical way to trial a vaccine is you sort of have a control population, you give 50% of them the vaccine, and then after a year you find out if the people who had the vaccine were less likely to catch, say, measles than otherwise. But you're saying in this sort of hyper fast sort of way of working out if a vaccine works, you don't have to, you know, vaccinate a certain degree of the population and then just wait to see who catches it. You can vaccinate this person and then a month later shove a coronavirus tissue in their face. And then if they don't catch it, then you've shown that the vaccine works.
Yes, and I want to emphasize that these are preliminary. They were talked about at our recent, we had a symposium discussing it in detail. And it's really the thing that means you can, which is good, you can do with this, is that you'd be able to give the vaccine, you'd be able to look to see their antibodies, you'd be able to get a good idea of exactly how much, you'd be able to see how much immunity had been generated. And then, again, I have to emphasize this would be in volunteers. You'd be able to sit there and figure out how much protection was offered.
And I've kind of got a stupid question now, which is that if we're putting all of these resources, all of these global resources into finding a vaccine for coronavirus, or COVID-19, that particular coronavirus, is it possible that a byproduct of this is that they sort of accidentally find a vaccine for the common cold?
So the common cold is caused by a rhinovirus, and one of the problems with rhinoviruses is that they are just so stupidly variable.
Okay, right.
So yeah, I mean, there is a lot of interesting information about different respiratory viruses and the reasons why we can or cannot make vaccines for them. In, you know, flu, for instance, classic flu. The issue is at around, you know, at some point in the year when you have an idea of what's going on in the Southern Hemisphere, a lot of people get together and they have a huge ring binder and they decide what are they going to put into the vaccine, because in order to make enough vaccine, you have to be doing it quite a long time in advance. And that's based on the flu strains which are currently circulating. And that's basically a attempt to guess what is going to be a problem that year elsewhere. So they make the vaccine, you give it, and if you get it right and the vaccine is good, then you're pretty, you know, you have good protection and you don't have a very severe flu season. Whereas
and that's why they shove loads of different flu strains in the same vaccine, don't they? So you get pumped with like loads of different flus.
Not all of them, unfortunately, but they do select the ones which are most likely to be giving you some kind of beneficial effect. And then if you get it right, you're sorted. And if you're not, then you're not. I mean, here's actually a fact that I want to put into context, because people have been saying things like, oh, this is just the flu. This is like, I was at a meeting in February with infectious disease doctors who would say this. This is not the flu. Like we were having a brief conversation yesterday about this, and influenza is a different virus. This is a coronavirus. Flu is caused by influenza viruses. They're a different sort of virus. Now, the thing about flu is that it's a pretty severe illness. If you've had it, you will really know it. And it does have a pretty decent mortality rate. But let's put it into context. In the last 3 weeks in the United States, more people have died of COVID than die in the entire year for flu seasons. Not all flu seasons, but, you know, mild to moderate flu seasons. Similarly, look at the number of people who have already died of COVID in New York City. This is somewhere north of 10,000 at the moment, okay? And they are still rolling in. They're slowing, but they're still rolling in. That is the sort of number that we would expect if flu had infected every single man, woman, and child in New York City. Because flu has a mortality rate, roughly speaking, very roughly speaking, of around 1 in 1,000. The fact that the COVID death rate is still continuing to tick up there, again, happily, slowly, but this is the consequence of all of the great physical distancing which has been done there. The fact it's still going up indicates that this is more dangerous than flu, and people should remember that.
Next technology I want to know about is antibody tests. So these have been put forward. So these are the tests that show whether you've got immunity to COVID-19 because you've previously had it. This has been put forward quite often, actually, I think, by our own government in the UK as a bit of a game changer. Like we can send them all to you. There'll be like a pregnancy test, and you'll find out if you're immune. They often don't work, but if they were to work, if we were to get online a very successful antibody test, would that be a game changer in terms of our societal response to coronavirus?
It would be a scientific game changer for sure. I mean, it's like, and I'm saying this as a person who, I forget when it was, but I tweeted like, Sero survey now, sometime over a month ago. And I was just basically saying, we want to go out and find out how many people have been exposed. This will tell us, this will give us so much great information about the proportion who might be immune. It'll give us some great information about the actual spectrum of severity. There might be people who are immune who cannot remember being ill, or who had very mild illness. But this comes with a number of different caveats. First of all, there is the issue with the tests themselves. The tests themselves must be able to distinguish the pandemic coronavirus from the other more innocuous coronaviruses, because otherwise you're going to be telling people, oh, you're immune to coronavirus, and they're not. That would be bad. The other thing we have to say is that we don't really know what level of antibodies would be correlating with protection at the moment. We don't know. It is even possible there's a thing called antibody-dependent enhancement, which could mean that people who had been exposed and had some levels of immunity were actually more vulnerable on encountering it the second time around. So all of these unknowns mean that even though it would be a scientifically incredibly important thing, and it's the sort of thing I really want to see, it's not going to be the kind of thing which is going to lead people to, it's not going to be able to just sort of throw open the doors and say, right, everyone out, back to work. Yeah. And I also want to sort of just take a moment to mention the fact that the availability of being able to get these things I want to make sure that we don't end up with this kind of, oh, if you're immune, then everything's okay, because you can see that having all kind of perverse consequences. I mean, for a start, it would introduce more inequality, even more inequality. You also might have people wanting to, trying to catch it so they can build immunity and get sort of the sign off that they were okay. And that brings us back into the situation where we have a surge which threatens healthcare. So it would be a game changer. I'd really love to see it, but it's, it would not answer all the questions. I also want to point out that some of the sort of results which are going around now, which you're probably seeing, are deeply dodgy, and you should be somewhat skeptical of them. But I think that we will get a much clearer picture over the next month or so.
So, but basically that's to say, so you think the antibody test could be a game changer in terms of our scientific understanding of the virus and sort of feed into models to see how many people have had it. But you're not imagining that immunity passports are going to be sort of the key to how we get society moving before we found a vaccine.
I think that if we knew that a lot of people had been infected, we might be able to be feeling a little bit more confident. And it would be mostly a scientific game changer.
All right, final question from me, and then I'm going to go to a couple of audience questions. So you can start tweeting those on the hashtag TiskiSour or put them in the comments on YouTube with a rocket emoji. The last one from me is another technology question. Test and trace apps, are they a game changer?
Yeah, I think they could be. And there was one that there was a really neat paper in Science a few weeks ago by an old friend of mine who's at the University of Oxford called Christoph Fraser, who's one of the finest epidemiologists in the country. And the thing which you can do with that is that you would be able to identify risky contacts of known cases. And that is such an extraordinary thing to be able to do. Now, let's imagine a future in which there is sick pay, such that anybody who is guaranteed good sick pay, such that anybody who is unwell can stay home. And then you get those people tested rapidly. When they come back positive, then you are able to identify everyone that their digital device has been sort of in close enough proximity to potentially transmit. And then if you send them a message and say, you may have been exposed, you can couple this with real-time mobility data and stuff like that. If you get that, then you can send them a little message saying, please stay at home and take precautions. We believe you may have COVID. And then if you imagine this, imagine the vision of people who would then say, oh, we'll pay them as well, so that they don't have to go to work and potentially expose people while they're asymptomatic. And then you send them a test. If you got a rapid test, then you can say, okay, you're positive. You're now in the stay there until you don't transmit anybody else. Whereas alternatively, if it comes back negative, it's like, go to work, with an element of caution that maybe you just haven't, turned positive yet. But I mean, things like that would be extraordinary. There is one other thing which I think could be really useful, which is monitoring sewage, because a proportion of people excrete the virus via that route, and you can detect it in wastewater. And don't want to scare people, making people think that that there's a transmission via this, because it doesn't really. I'm not really clear that there is. I mean, it doesn't seem to be survivable. It's more like viral genetic material that you can detect. I mean, do take precautions, wash your hands several times a day, 20 seconds and all that, and try to avoid touching your face. But basically, since this is the case, you can then sort of look for the virus in the wastewater, and when you find it, you can sort of look at the amounts of it and say, this looks like there's a lot of community transmission going on. Maybe we need to do something about reinstating physical distancing to calm it down. So there's a lot of things that we're learning about this. And I mean, I gave a talk to the US Chamber of Commerce Foundation a few weeks ago, in which I made the point that there are lots of clever ways in which we can think of moving with this and, be ingenious and do stuff which is going to get us much closer to being able to, we won't be able to get back to normal, but we'll be able to get, a whole lot more of our lives and our freedoms back.
And would we presumably you test the sewage because it was, I suppose, cheaper than just mass community testing?
Oh, yeah, it's much easier, yeah. It's like a question. I mean, there are interesting questions here. It's like, if you think that somebody might, if you've got a shortage of tests and you think somebody might in a household have it, do you take like a swab from everybody in the household and then put them together and test that? And then when it comes back positive, you can do further testing to identify exactly who it was. So there's
that's super interesting. In your ice, so you could just mix up all the swabs of one isopod if we're going down that route, where you have sort of 10 allotted people who you're allowed to contact, and then and then you just isolate them all if one of them is positive.
Yeah.
Fox is telling me to go to audience questions. He's quite right. I'm hogging all of the questions at this point in time. Nina Wolf tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. What is the evidence in catching COVID-19 more than once? Loads of stories about this online, not only seasonally, but soon after.
So the evidence at the moment is that you have to really distinguish between a couple of things. The first is just a resurgence of disease. So there's been a point where the virus is just sort of following one of these courses, which is not inevitable. I mean, people often think that a virus does a sort of inevitable thing, which you get it and it gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, and then you get better. But sometimes it can move up and down. So it could be that you were tested positive at first, and then there was an element, the virus, it was just sort of, the infection was somewhat under control and then it got worse again. Or I think what is more likely is that it's issues with testing. Because some of these, I mean, you must know that by now there is there's so many different tests available. And some of them are really sensitive and specific, and others are not. I mean, we, in the US, I know of many people who have had symptoms which I would assume have to be COVID, and yet who have been testing negative. And I would suspect that what is actually happening here is where you see a number of tests which are positive, and then one which is negative because it didn't work, and then it becomes positive again. So I think that that's probably what's happening in the majority of those cases. Now, I can also know that, again, early on, we could see that there were some cases where you'd have people who were being testing positive and then negative. And then in some cases, they might be repatriated from somewhere where they've been in quarantine and then test positive again. And that can be because, sometimes the tests will be differently sensitive depending if you take one swab or two swabs, or, how hard do you look? These are all sorts of things which are going on. But at the moment, I don't think that reinfection soon after I don't think that it's the case, but I do want to point out, we are having enough trouble counting who is infected once, let alone figuring out exactly who's been infected twice. But in the majority of cases, I think it's due to the test sensitivity.
And the normal expectation with a coronavirus, if I'm correct, is sort of a year or two.
Yeah,
the
immunity wanes over that sort of period of time. But again, we don't know what's going to happen with this one.
Dono Evil, I like the name, asks, how likely is a mutation to occur that makes any vaccine or natural immunity useless?
That's a great question. By the way, I'm going to do a shout out for the Center for Communicable Disease Dynamics website. We've got a COVID website, which includes all kinds of stuff on there, including even the ability for members of the public to donate, which has got a bunch of things and blogs which include questions like that. There's one I wrote back at the start of February. You're going to hear a lot of stuff about mutation. Don't be too worried about mutations. Mutations are just a sign that it's replicating. Mutations do not necessarily have any consequence. Now, once there is substantial population immunity, then there will be what evolutionary biologists term diversifying selection upon the spike protein, which is, most likely the thing which will be recognized. And that may start to accumulate the sort of variation that will enable it to escape. However, and again, this is just based on what my knowledge is of other coronaviruses, so this is what I think will happen. If, as Michael was just saying, we see a thing where the immunity is waning over a couple of years, then that selection pressure will be weaker because we will end up having a better supply for the virus of susceptibles. This is why infectious disease epidemiologists always talk about the resupply of susceptibles. So if you're talking about measles, for instance, measles gives you lifetime immunity, but you get outbreaks in the absence of a vaccine every 2 years, because that's how long it takes for enough kids to be born and who are not immune, enter the cohort, and then you will suddenly have a sufficient population that is capable of maintaining a measles outbreak. So taken the fact that if this does not produce lifetime immunity, then I don't think there's going to be that much pressure to be able to escape and get in there. But as I say, we shall see.
I shouldn't be agreeing. I just really like the phrase resupply of susceptibles. That's sort of like a phrase for people, or people without immunity in any case. Patrick tweets on the hashtag Tizky how realistic is the government's statement that human vaccine trials are starting? They've announced that this week.
I don't know, because I haven't seen the UK government saying. I mean, there will be people will be starting to do trials in various different sort of levels. You have stage 1, 2, and 3 trials, and they're various. You want to be able to, first of all, the first thing that you want to do is make sure that whatever you're doing is not actually harmful in any way. So but I have no idea what about this specifically they are referring to, so I don't think I can really comment on that.
I think, and I'm at risk of being wrong here, but I think if I'm correct, that what the government have announced is that today they've started, putting a vaccine in a human for the first time. But
that
sort of as you were saying before, they haven't yet, to find out if it works, they either need to give it to a large proportion of the population, then wait a period of time, or shove a coronavirus tissue in their face. So as far as I understand, no coronavirus tissue has been shoved in anyone's face.
No, I'd hope not without very careful ethical, sort of human subjects research.
Yeah. All right, this is our final question from Love Football, Hate FIFA. Tweets on the hashtag Tizky. Presumably there's a story behind that. Without a vaccine and no evidence of strong immunity for people who've had the virus, is there any reasonable alternative way to end the lockdown than a mass program of test and trace?
First of all, I'm going to want to shout out, it's a great name, Love Football, Hate FIFA. I've got mine. That's from the last Arsenal game that was overseen by Arsene Wenger. Just get the Arsenal shout out there. I think that without that, there is not I think regardless of the exact answer to the question, test and trace and the huge amount and more testing is necessary for the way out for every single thing we have been talking about. It is literally the centerpiece of every sort of discussion that we've been having, every possible way we've been gaming out the future. And as a result, I really think that testing is incredibly, incredibly important. By the way, since that's the last question, I just want to say something to everyone. If you are anxious about what your government is doing to help you and others, don't forget that there are things that you can do. You are able to help the vulnerable in your community. You're able to sort of find the old people who are scared to go to the shops and go buy their groceries if you're young and fit, or you think you've had it already, and then leave it on their doorstep and teach them how to use apps for transferring money. Right now, the suburb of Boston, which is Chelsea, actually, it's not that Chelsea, it's a suburb of Boston, which is Chelsea, is experiencing a really, really tough surge. And so we've got a bunch of groceries which we are going to be putting outside our house in, well, probably around now, actually. And it's going to be picked up by somebody who's going to drive it over and give it to needy families who are unable to go to the grocery store themselves, or also to help people in families, for instance, who are, there are some people where there are kids, both of whose parents were in a single parent household where their parent is hospitalized. So there's a huge amount of stuff that you can do throughout society to help others. And I would really urge you to think about the way that you can do that, both now and in the future.
I was just going to move my head because you can see behind me there's this mutual aid poster from my local area. There's probably one in your borough or ward as well. Actually, before I let you go, I just want to ask one more sort of personal question in terms of sort of like your experience of all of this, which is that have you been surprised by how shitty so many governments have been at responding to COVID-19, or is there a degree to which you're sort of like, wow, actually they, it might have been late, but they have now come to grips with it to a degree that you weren't expecting? Sort of like, how would you, I don't want to do a rate out of 10 because it's a bit tacky, but sort of like, what's your overall impression of how governments have responded to this? Are you surprised that they've been so slow, or surprised that they've actually got round to dealing with it and implementing things as sort of extreme as lockdowns in the end?
Oh, great question. So in the first place, I want to compliment Germany. Germany has done phenomenally so far. Absolutely astonishing. It's a model for what is possible. I do say, however, it is so far because they're starting to relax things. We'll see what's coming out. Now, the answer to your question, I think, is that it takes a long time for people to accept what is happening. There is an sort of an OMG moment that happens in a pandemic when people suddenly realize what they're actually up against. And for a long time, they don't want to believe that it's there. It's denial. And so I think a lot of countries, governments, have been in denial, and they have just sort of refused to accept that it's there, refused to accept what is necessary. You seize on whatever piece of comforting news you can think of, and you try to avoid, taking decisions that you find uncomfortable. But what we are learning is that there's a big difference between, I cannot do that and I do not want to do that. They're not the same thing at all. What you need to do is communicate honestly with people about what risks are, communicate honestly about what can be done, communicate honestly about what you are trying to do. Do not try to massage it in any way, shape, or form. This is a virus. Nature cannot be fooled. If you are level with people and treat them seriously, then you can expect to be treated seriously by them. I would have a certain sympathy for anybody who's in government when a pandemic hits. But to be honest, I'm still waiting for some to kind of wake up and smell the coffee.
Okay, Bill, thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time this evening. I know, I can imagine how busy you are during this period as an epidemiologist in the middle of a pandemic. So we do really appreciate your time. And thank you also to our audience. You've been watching Tysky Sour, you've been watching Novara Media. If you've enjoyed this show, please click the subscribe button on YouTube, and chuck us a few pounds on novaramedia.com/support. We'll be back tomorrow I think, with a newsy show. So it kind of depends what happens in the world of politics over the next 24 hours. I've been Michael Walker. We've been Novara Media. This has been Tysky Sour. Good night.